Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It is that time in the year when our city produces a 5-year forecast. And this is the beginning of a budget process that really wraps up in April. And so the first step is for our budget team to actually put together what we think the expected revenues and expenses are going to be for the next 5 years. And that's what we're sharing with you today, and also will be discussed at City Council this evening. And these numbers get worked over and refined and the assumptions over the next 3 or 4 months, but this is an important first piece into understanding where we are financially as a city. And so the City of Albuquerque right now is forecasted to have a combined $40 million deficit for the next 2 years. Now, this is based on a 5-year forecast from 2018 to 2022. And it obviously is primarily built on information that was gathered last year. Now, for us, there's a couple of things that are important in here. Our city finances in aggregate can approach $1 billion, but our general fund is roughly about $500 million. So we'll talk about perspectives on what this means in the end, but this is a very significant amount, and it's going to be a serious challenge that City Council and our administration are going to have to deal with going forward. So this report predicts this budget deficit, which is from a combination of revenue shortfalls and some required infrastructure upgrades. And our economists have shown that we're facing this budget challenge in part because of a differential in the forecasted revenues, which were 3.3%, and the revenues that have come in, which have grown about 1.7%. And so that differential is driving a lot of these deficits. I also want to mention that fundamentally, our budget is a reflection of our priorities, and in many ways, the budget is a moral document for the City of Albuquerque. And because we have a deficit situation, we are really going to have to focus on prioritizing what is important this year for our city. And a piece of that is also understanding that we've got to find ways to step up for our officers. And we also have to prioritize job creation and keep our kids at the forefront of the budget process this year. Now, later on this week, or perhaps the beginning of next week, our office will issue the second piece of this budget process, which is known as the call. And that's going to list out those priorities. Those will be the executive priorities as we build a budget around those items. But those three are going to be what I just mentioned, which is finding a way to step up for our frontline officers to attack crime and reduce crime in Albuquerque, finding a way to step up for our kids, and also do more on job creation. And we're going to have to do that in a budget deficit environment. So the challenge ahead is very significant and no doubt will be a little bumpy, but we're confident we're going to be able to get there. So some other specifics based that this forecast is based on. I mentioned that this year, so the remaining chunk of this year, there's a $5.9 million deficit. We're pretty confident in how we can deal with that, but it certainly is meaningful, but that's something that is actually relatively routine. So we'll be able to deal with that. The big issue is the budget that we'll be debating for next year, which has a $39.9 million deficit projected. I mentioned the difference between GRT growth from roughly 3% to 1.7%. Also, overall general fund revenues are down $10 million as compared to last year. Now, the 5-year outlook is a little bit lower than was previously forecasted, and that also has to do with the reduction in something called the hold harmless reimbursements that come from the state of New Mexico. So basically every year we get less from the state as a share of GRT, and there's a whole history behind that. But we continue to be penalized essentially for that, along with every other city and county in New Mexico. And so that's an uphill battle that we have to fight no matter what. That is now part of state law. Now, the last thing I want to mention on this is that we've got to be creative going forward on this, and we also have to prioritize the issues that I mentioned. Now, part of that is understanding how we got here. And so what I want to end with, we're going to hand this out, so you'll have a copy to zoom in on if you want or don't want to. But these two charts are very, very instructive in terms of how we got here. So the top one right here, this is the revenues that we've been getting. And as you can see, they have been steadily going up since 2017. And then we also look at our estimated expenses, and that includes more or less fixed costs around infrastructure and healthcare and some other things. And we see this continued gap. So we do have a structural deficit that we're going to have to deal with. And the next question that I usually get is, how big is this with respect to history? And that's the second chart here. So if we look at the second chart, this is backwards looking to 2010. You can see the various deficits that we've had based on the 5-year forecast. And obviously in 2010, and again, you'll be able to see this, but 64 million roughly was the deficit then 54 million the next year, 40 million in 2012. Then we had very reasonable deficits here, and then as you can see, it's been creeping up, and then of course right now we're back up to 40. So this is a relatively high deficit year for the city. We have not seen these deficits since 2012, and so that's why this is a lot more significant than what we saw in the 3-year period from 2013 to 2014. But as you can see last year, you could see deficits were doubling, and they continue to do so this year. And so we've got to do what we can to try and reverse this trend. So I think with that, I just want to check. We have here with us our budget director and also our CFO, Sanjay Bhakta. We have our COO, Lawrence Rael, as well. So I'm just going to check with them. First, our CFO, anything that should be clarified or amended to?
I'll say.
Thanks.
No.
Okay, great. And anything you want to add?
No, I think we're good.
All right. So with that, we have some time for some questions. And so I think we mentioned too, we'll just go one at a time, but if there's time, we'll go back around. Martine, saw your hand first.
Will there need to be layoffs or tax increases given what you guys are dealing with?
I certainly hope not, and I can't imagine that at the end of the day, given what we want to prioritize, that is going to happen. The tougher question is how do we actually get more officers on the streets? And we're going to be working with our police chief and with city council to find out a way to do that. Also want to introduce our city councilor, Pat Davis, is here. And so those are the right questions that we're going to have to deal with in the next 3 months. Yeah.
Tax breaks to developers like the group behind Windrock, are they hurting the city's tax base?
When we have tax increment districts, those always essentially shift the current receipt of taxes from the future receipt of taxes. So they're actually neutral in a sense that we wouldn't have had that tax income had that tax increment program not been in place. But they certainly, because they are in place and now Windrock is growing, you could look at it that way. But I think that's actually a question of interpretation at the end of the day. But those also predate, I think those were in place almost 10 years ago. So regardless of how you want to answer that question, that is not anything new. Yeah.
The city council is looking at an ordinance that requires APD to be fully staffed, fully funded. With this deficit, how are we going to do that?
So we are going to do that by getting as creative as we can and also by prioritizing law enforcement. And the details on that are really what the rest of the 4-month process is for. Our administration will propose some ideas to council, and then they're ultimately going to have to decide. That is the legislative branch's purview. Now, right now, we want to make sure everything is on the table. And so we're actually looking at dozens of options, from different structures with sweeping funds and using bonding and all sorts of revenue generators so that we actually can make an informed choice. So what this administration aims to do is say, look, here's 9 ways we can fix the budget, here's our preference, and then our city council will have to make a decision. Yeah.
You mentioned some capital improvement projects. I mean, has arts been an impact on this budget deficit?
So the hopeful thing is that it hasn't been to date. As long as we get reimbursed in a timely manner, we're going to be okay with respect to that. But as we mentioned last week, there is no certainty around that. And so we're very concerned about that. And actually these numbers assume payment for that. So the numbers actually could look a lot more negative if we continue to face delays and so forth from the feds. Do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Mayor. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me just check. Anyone else before Martine goes round 2?
Yeah.
Sure.
But what about the operating costs for art? Because that will be something new, right? That's being added to the budget, to the operating budget?
That's correct. And again, I'll let Lawrence chime in here if I don't do this right because it's my understanding that we have 2 years where the operating, 3 years where operations are built in to both our budget and in the reimbursement from the feds. After that, it's a separate question, and we're going to have to figure out what to do.
Yeah, it's,
Go ahead.
from my previous work with the Rail Runner, it's, there are federal funds that are available for demonstration projects. So art falls under that category. And so there is a opportunity for us to avail ourselves of some federal funds for the first 3 years of the operation of art to pay for the operating costs. Year 4, we'll have to absorb those dollars. But fortunately, those monies have been approved already.
Are we looking at cutting any like certain city programs or anything to save some money?
As in terms of everything being on the table, we are. We want to look at our overall cost levels in each department, and we also want to look at the contracts. We do a lot of contracted work. We're going to have to evaluate all of those, and it's appropriate to do it given the size of this deficit. And right now, we're going to focus on understanding the options available, and we'll see what those options look like come January and February, and we'll be able to speak to whether or not we're going to recommend that should be done.
So those, prioritizing and what the options are, that's what will come later then? We don't know what those are yet?
Right, yeah, so this is, there's kind of, and Jerry could do this more articulately, but let's say there's a couple of steps here. First is the forecast, then we work internally to come up with our priorities as administration. We'll suggest a draft budget, then it goes through council. They have a markup process of their own, some committee hearings and so forth, and then ultimately it comes back to us, and there's also always the veto process, and I guess they would really be over traditionally by April. Obviously the fiscal year starts I think July 1, so that's really when you have to have your ducks in a row no matter what.
And I just would just maybe add, Mayor, just keep in mind that we're talking about two different pieces, right? We're talking about the current budget in the current year, as the Mayor described earlier, that's got a $6 million deficit. So that we've got to manage between now and the end of June. The other portion the Mayor was talking about is the budget going into the next fiscal year that will be starting in July, and that's the part the Mayor is talking about that has the $39 million deficit. So that's where we really, as he said, we have to do the prioritization and looking at what we're doing citywide as opposed to what we have currently in the system.
Would there be any changes to the remainder of this fiscal year to kind of help offset that deficit in July?
We're going to see what we can find. We're up against the clock on that because there's only about 6 months left. But this is a situation, especially with the new administration, there might have been several. It could even be things like marketing campaigns or you name what the issues are. That is a good place for us to look for short-term savings. And so there's also different hiring things with respect to, maybe we wait on a few big decisions for the next budget cycle when we have more certainty and so forth. So we'll look to all of those kinds of issues in the next 6 months. And that's also something, that is the one thing I think that is very much expected, and that would happen even if you had a new administration and a budget surplus.